Now this evening, we're not going to talk about battles and divisions and brigades and regiments. We're going to talk about a person. A person just like you and I, who just happened to be cast at that time in history. He sweat, he bled. How many people, let's do a little bit of perusing here. How many people can tell me how many brothers and sisters Robert E. Lee had? Okay. How many people can tell me how many children Robert E. Lee had? Okay. It's interesting, the children always show up after he goes home on leave 9 months later. Yeah, right. Now, I was asked if I could curtail this program at one time to 25 or 30 minutes. No. I've spoken at the Lee Findle House. I've spoken on this program in 3 different states. It runs about 47 minutes. If anybody has to get up to go to the loop, please go. But I hope you won't be bored and no one's ever fallen asleep, including the staff at Arlington House. Now, it was tough to come up with this program, Robert E. Lee, not just a soldier. We don't see many pictures of Lee. This is what Lee looks like just before the War of Secession starts. And we don't see many pictures of him not in a uniform. 63% of his life is in a uniform. 63% of his life. Now, a lot of people forget, we only think about the last 4 years he served in a uniform. Before that, the man was in uniform for 36 years in the United States Army. 36 years, and walked away from that to do what he thought was right. So it was quite a challenge. But this evening, we're going to talk about the dutiful son, the young man, the student, the thoughtful brother, the devoted husband, the caring and loving father, the engineer, the farm manager. He was a farm manager. The executor and the businessman and the educator. We're also going to talk about the man. I'm sorry, Robert Duvall and Martin Sheen did a pretty good job in Gettysburg and Gods and Generals. However, Robert E. Lee didn't wear his dress uniform to go fight battles every day. We're going to get first-hand accounts of what he wore when he went to work. We're going to tell you what he looks like, and he wasn't 7'2". We got the official records from the Academy, what his height was. We're going to tell you what he liked and disliked. Oh, everybody in this room, there's certain things you like and certain things we don't like. And he was the same way. We're going to tell you about some of those things. We're going to talk about his pets. Guy loved pets. Dogs and cats, horses. He did. Talk about when he went to church. Houses, yet he never owned a home of his own. He never owned a house, ever. And we're going to talk about his health, because every one of us in here has health concerns, especially more so these days, I guess, because we hear about it more. And the final recall and the restoration. Now, I don't want to leave too much about the military out, but I've got to tell you some of the things, words that people use to describe Robert E. Lee by his peers. Dutiful, methodical, audacious, frugal, rational, kind, humble, inspiring, calculating, self-assured, thoughtful, religious, prudent, considerate, pragmatic, devoted, indefatigable, and disciplined. Wow. I don't think nobody knows me that well to come up with all those descriptions of me. And as far as his military prowess and as far as his abilities, some of you may not have heard that one of the longest serving officers in the United States Army was General Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott was only the second person to be made a lieutenant general, 3 stars after Washington was, until they gave it to Grant in '64. So Winfield Scott was a pretty good soldier. Listen to what Winfield Scott says about Robert E. Lee, who served under him in the Mexican War. Quote, "I tell you, sir, that Robert E. Lee is the greatest soldier now living, and if he ever gets the opportunity, he will prove himself the greatest captain in history." That's coming from Winfield Scott, one of the most venerable members of the military in our republic. Now, the dutiful son. Robert Edward Lee was born on a Monday, January 19th, 1807 in Stratford Hall in Westmoreland County, Virginia. His parents were Henry Lee III, Light Horse Harry, and Anne Hill Carter Lee. He was named after his mother's 2 brothers, Robert and Edward. She named her son after her 2 brothers. That's how much she thought of him. Now we're going to briefly talk about his parents. A lot of people have heard about Light Horse Harry Lee. Well, he lived to be 62 years of age, and Light Horse Harry Lee was born into money, the Lee family, near Dumfries, Virginia, which is below Quantico, the Marine base now. And he was off to go study law in London after he graduated from Princeton. He was 17 when he graduated from university. Smart young fellow, very smart. Blonde, blue-eyed, really a ladies' killer. Everybody liked him, and he was very intelligent. Well, we rebel against the lawful authority. For 8 generations, we've been members of the crown. The King of England's been our legal government. And we rebelled. And Light Horse Harry Lee says, I'm not going to go to London, I'm not going to go to law school, so he joins up. Light Horse Harry Lee was a ruthless, calculating, skillful, excellent cavalry officer who fought in the northern campaigns and came to Washington's attention. He gets transferred to the South and served under Nathaniel Greene and raises quite a bit of havoc here in the South. He's a very capable young man. He's in his early 20s and he's in charge of hundreds of men. How many of us in that room know how big our ego was then? Yeah, right. And he liked a lot of attention. And he was very popular with a lot of people, particularly the ladies. Well, he was a bit high-strung. He fights in the campaign in the Revolution in the South. He witnesses Cornwallis surrender. Now, we all know the war doesn't end in 1881 when Cornwallis surrenders. There's 2 more years of war before we become a free nation after England leaves. So that's the final big battle. Well, he thinks he should be promoted to general, and the Congress, who he had tweaked all their noses at one time or the other, didn't promote him. So he quit. He resigned his commission, went home. Marries his cousin, Matilda. Matilda owned Stratford Hall. Matilda Lee. Light Horse Harry Lee does not own that house. His wife, Matilda, does. Well, they have 4 children. 3 survive. And at the ripe old age of 27, Matilda died. So now he's a bachelor. So he's a bachelor trying to raise children. Oh, and there's one really bad thing about Light Horse Harry Lee. He's a spendthrift. He is terrible with money. Terrible with money. And when he locates a new bride-to-be, when he's serving in the state and federal government, he marries into the famous Carter family of Virginia. Anne Hill Carter, to be Robert E. Lee's mother, was beautiful, but she was mesmerized by this dashing fellow. He ends up being the governor of Virginia. She's got the money. He does well. Like George Washington had done with Martha Custis, George married up. Martha had the money. Light Horse Harry Lee marries up into the Carter family. She's got the money. It was said of Light Horse Harry Lee that he would borrow money he could not repay and loan money he did not have. That's what they said. That's how bad he was with money. So he was a spendthrift. Luckily, the wife was the breadwinner because of all her annuities and the money she had. That was quite very fortunate. Well, he's the governor of Virginia. He serves in the Congress. And meanwhile, things aren't going too good. And he's still spending more and more money. Washington appoints him the commanding general to quell the Risky Rebellion in Pennsylvania. So he's a general. He finally gets to be a general. He comes back. He serves in the Congress. And in 1799, Washington had really pretty much watched out for him. Washington dies. And you may recall the famous lines that he penned of Washington on his death: first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Well, he has no viable means of support other than his wife's money, and the bills piled up. He couldn't pay for the house. He had to sign the house over to his son, Light Horse Harry Lee's son, Henry IV. He signed the house over to him because he couldn't pay the bills. Oh, and his debtors that he owes money to take him to court, and the former governor and the Revolutionary War hero and to be Robert E. Lee's father goes to jail for a year in debtor's prison. He goes to jail in Westmoreland County and Spotsylvania County Courthouse. But while he's in there, he writes a best-selling book that I'd highly recommend you read today, The Revolutionary War Memoirs of General Henry Lee. They're still published. I'd still recommend you read it because the first 30 pages are introduction by his son, which is fantastic reading about the family. So that's a really good resource. Well, his wife's not happy living in Stratford Hall, so when he gets out of jail, he signs the house over to his son from his first marriage, the 23-year-old son. They move to Alexandria, Virginia, right outside of Washington City. They live with family. They don't have a house. They don't own any of the houses. He owns some lots, but he doesn't have a house. So they're living with relatives. Well, Robert E. Lee's mother must have been a fantastic person because she was very understanding. She was very rich. She helped out her husband. They had children. It went quite well. But Light Horse Harry Lee is high maintenance. Well, early 1800s, Light Horse Harry Lee we're getting ready to go to war. We're going to go to war with France. We're going to go to war with England. So we go to war with who? England. War of 1812. Light Horse Harry Lee gets an appointment by President Madison to be a general. Well, he gets involved in politics and he goes over to Baltimore in Maryland, and some of his friends and he are protesting the policies against the French. There's a big riot, and they arrest them all. They put him in the Baltimore City jail. The other faction, the pro-French, break into the jail, kill one of his compatriots, and nearly beat Light Horse Harry Lee to death. Leave him dead, bleeding in the gutter, slit his nose, lost his left eye. He said his head was bandaged for months when he came back to Alexandria. Well, the debts are rising. His doctor says, you need to go somewhere where it's warmer climate. And he did. Light Horse Harry Lee abandoned his family and went to the Caribbean, to Barbados. He never saw them again. It was quite sad. So Lee's mother is a single mom, raising children. She was a very, very strong person. He would write letters to the family that he was going to return. He tried to return, but he died on the way back. He stopped in Georgia, Cumberland Island. His old former commander's plantation was there. Green was dead. Green's daughter took care of Light Horse Harry Lee, and he died at the ripe old age of 62. So he's buried in Georgia. However, they removed his body and took it to Washington Lee University later in 1913. So Lee's mother is now a widow. She's still got a couple of her children living at home. It's quite amazing that she takes care of them. And the older brother goes to Harvard University and goes to law school, Charles. We'll talk about them shortly. But Lee is the youngest son, Robert is, and his sister, they're still living at home. And her health deteriorates, his mother's health. In 1824, when the Marquis de Lafayette comes through to see them, he almost did not recognize her. She had progressed from being carried with a cane and a wheelchair as a result of childbearing and arthritis. At the house on Orinoco Street in Old Town Alexandria, the neighbors would say that they would witness Robert picking his mother up, carrying her to the carriage, taking out his pocket knife, cutting pieces of newspaper out to plug the holes in the carriage so the wind wouldn't get in. They had name, but they didn't have much money, and that was really sad and weighed on her. She had to sell off a lot of her property, livestock, servants, just to make ends meet. It was quite sad. Well, she would tell her oldest son not to borrow money because they couldn't pay it back. And Robert E. Lee's mother, when he gets his appointment to West Point, she writes a friend, quote, "How can I live without Robert? He is both son and daughter to me." She was a loving mother and a heartbroken wife. When Lee left, she would live her last 4 years with various relatives in the Alexandria area, and she died within a month after he graduated from West Point. She was 46 years old. Now, here's a description of the young Robert E. Lee by his peers at West Point. Good-looking, dark-haired, healthy. He was bright, quite studious, a loving son who idolized his father's memory but from a distance. He was only 4 when they moved from Stratford Hall into Alexandria. Well, his first schooling is at the Carter. Remember, his mom's a Carter, and in the Fauquier County area outside of Washington City, beautiful part of the country still today. He goes to a private school at Eastern View Farm, where he's giving his education there. Beautiful part of Virginia. His legal guardian, Thomas Turner, lived by near Kinloch Farm. It's still a beautiful place. You can't get on there now because somebody richer than God lives there. But it's really a nice place. It really is. I've gotten close. But it's quite lovely. It was called White Plains. Now it's called the Plains. So he's being basically farmed out between Alexandria and relatives' houses out in the country. He spent a lot of time there. He developed his riding skills there. He bonded with a horse when he was a teenager at Kinloch Farm that he rode daily by the name of Fancy Traveler. Fancy Traveler. How about that when he's a young boy? So he's back and forth. He goes back to Alexandria. He's enrolled in the Alexandria Academy. His primary teacher was William Leary, and they stayed friends until Leary died in 1869. Lee studied the classics, history, and excelled in mathematics. He sensed that a life in the military would be his calling, and he enrolled in a prep school run by a Quaker schoolmaster by the name of Benjamin Hallowell. Hallowell said that Lee's intellectual skills, command of the classics, and particularly mathematics, propelled him to attend West Point. How did somebody like Robert E. Lee get into West Point? He didn't have any money. His father was famous. Well, a lot of people thought a lot of his family. His father's reputation as a defender of the Republic was a great help. His application was forwarded by the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun. It was also endorsed by 4 members of the Congress, 5 U.S. senators, and without reservation signed by President James Monroe, himself a Revolutionary War veteran. You may or not know that Monroe crossed the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776, with General Washington when they went into Trenton. So, Lee is being described as good-looking, dark-haired, and healthy. And he's about 70 to 72 inches tall. He's not 6'5", between 70 inches and 72 inches tall from the West Point records. So he does quite well. Now, this is what they said about life at West Point in the 19th century. Gee, no satellite, no mobile phones, no cable. They said it was droll and Spartan. I guess because they lived in LIFE like I do in the country where I don't have satellite or cable. And people say, what do you do? I say, well, I have a life. He didn't have any trouble acclimating himself. He was regimented. He was well disciplined. He was self-controlled. He excelled in his drawing studies, his classics, his horsemanship, tactics, mathematics, and the highly prized field. What's the jewel in the crown at West Point still today? The School of Engineering. That's the main school that you want to go to if you go to the academy, and he excelled there. It was unbelievable. Lee graduated second in his class in 1829, did not get one demerit. They would give you demerits for singing after dark. If you look at Custer's record, sneaking off to Benny Haven's Tavern, singing in ranks, candles on after dark. I mean, they would give you a demerit if your gig line. The old military guys know what your gig line is. Your gig line's out of line, you get a demerit for that. Not one demerit in 4 years. It's unbelievable. Now, how come he ended up second? There's a fella that beat him out by 1/10 of 1 point. Anybody know what happened to him?
He was a lawyer.
Well, yeah, it's close.
He didn't do much with it.
Well, he did okay. He did okay. It was Charles Mason, and he would leave the Army after 2 years, and he was an engineer. He was a patent attorney. Sorry there, Adjutant, he was an attorney. But he did okay. He was the first Chief Justice of the state of Iowa, so he did all right. But he got out of the military. Now, let's talk about Robert E. Lee being a brother. We focus on Lee a lot just by himself, but we don't know about his brothers and sisters. Now, remember the first marriage? There are 4 children, 3 survive. Well, Philip dies when he's 8. So really, Lee doesn't get to know him. Now, Henry Lee IV, Black Horse Harry was his nickname. Now, his dad was Light Horse Harry. Anybody know why he's Black Horse Harry? Well, Black Horse Harry, of course, he gets Stratford Hall because they sign it over to him because Light Horse Harry Lee can't afford the bills. He married a 16-year-old wealthy neighbor's daughter, Anne McClarty. She had a shipload of money. So he married well too. Those guys, I tell you, they all married up. They did really well. They restored Stratford Hall to its former glory. Dark Horse, his son was a writer, historian, soldier, and politician. He was in the local militia. When their young daughter fell down the steps at Stratford Hall, anybody been to Stratford Hall? There's these humongous steps in the front, and the little girl fell down those steps and she died. The wife was overwrought with grief, and she had her sister come in. This is where we get Black Horse Harry. Black Horse Harry and the sister had a thing, and they had an affair. So that's how come he got the nickname of Black Horse Harry, because he was messing around with his sister-in-law while his wife was ill. Well, guess what? They both left him. So he's like, oh, okay. So he has to end up selling the house. Well, the wife comes back, and they go to Paris. He gets nominated by President Jackson to serve as a consulate in Paris, but the Congress couldn't agree on it. Now, can you imagine the Congress who can't agree on the color of an orange today not being able to agree on appointing him? The Congress couldn't agree on anything. Isn't it hard to believe? Right. So He contracts influenza and dies in Paris, and his wife contracts influenza and they both die, and Robert E. Lee's half-brother, Dark Horse Harry, is buried in Paris. He's got another half-sister, Lucy Lee Carter. She married into the Carter family, and she dies in 1860, but she's 74 years old when she dies. His brother was 44. Now, let's talk about Lee's two brothers and two sisters. His real brother and sister, not half. Charles Carter Lee lived to be 74. He did quite well. He attended Harvard. He graduated. He was an attorney. He practiced in Washington City. He also practiced law in Virginia and Mississippi. He and Robert stayed in constant contact. And he married into the Taylor family. Lucy Taylor, a member and a niece of Zachary Taylor, President Taylor's family, another good old Virginia family. So he did all right too. But they were in touch. They stayed in constant touch. And he actually would outlive Robert by 2 years. Anne Kinloch Lee Marshall. Remember the Kinloch farm? Middle name Kinloch. She dies in 1864. She was described as being sickly, delicate, frail, requiring expensive medical treatments in Philadelphia. She married Judge William C. Marshall. Chief Justice John Marshall family, married into that family. And she lived in Baltimore. She stayed in Baltimore when the war started, and she died in 64. Sidney Lee Smith, they called him, Sidney Smith Lee, they called him Smith. He was 5 years older than Robert. He got a commission as a midshipman and did quite well in the Navy. He was promoted to lieutenant, served in the Mexican War, where he reunited with Robert during the war there when Robert was a captain. In 1850, he was promoted to commander. In 53, he went with Commodore Perry when they opened up Japan to the Western world. He was also the commandant of the Naval Academy, Robert E. Lee's brother, Smith. And you may know more about Smith. He tried to resign his commission, as did Robert, when the war began. The Navy wouldn't accept it. They kicked him out. They wouldn't let him resign. They dismissed him. He goes to the Confederate Navy. He rises in ranks there, has a great deal of responsibility. He died unexpectedly in 1869, and it shocked Robert. You may know him better. Smith's son was Fitzhugh Lee, the cavalry commander in the Confederate Army. And then we have Catherine Mildred Lee Child. There are a few letters. Apparently Lee and his sister weren't that close. She married Edward Vernon Child. They lived abroad mainly. After she died at the age of 45, Robert assisted her children in going to university and helped them pay their educational fees. Now, fellas, listen up. Robert E. Lee is a devoted husband. Now, Robert E. Lee's got a lot going on in his life. Military, gone a lot. Then the war, 36 years in the Army. But you know what? Guys, listen up. Lee always enjoyed the company of young, lively, intelligent women. Now, there's been some things made about that. He corresponded with Marky Chestnut, who was one of his nieces through marriage. There was nothing going on there. He just liked intelligent young people. Guys, girls, he just liked young people. And he liked intelligent women. Family tradition holds that he first met his wife when he was a boy, but they were teenagers, and they didn't really get together that much. But we have solid proof that Robert E. Lee and Mary Ann Randolph Custis met while they were both visiting Kinloch Farm in Fauquier County. He was 20 and she was 19. She had been born at a relative's estate, Ravensworth, which is in Alexandria today, in Alexandria, Virginia. It was a big plantation then. When she was 2 months old, her parents took her to Arlington House. Now, we're going to touch on her parents real quickly because there's a lot more with them that we don't know, but I won't bore you with it. Robert E. Lee's father-in-law was George Washington Parke Custis. He was the grandson of Martha Washington Custis and George Washington's adopted son. Now, remember, when George marries Martha, they have no children. Martha has 4 children. 2 of them live to be adults, but she outlives all of them. And when her son Jackie dies, and then his wife remarried, and then she died, Washington adopts the grandchildren, which is not uncommon. And you see that today. You have some grandparents raising children today. So it's not uncommon in the 18th century as well. So George Washington Parke Custis. He was a writer, an orator, a farmer, an artist, and basically he was a perpetuator of the artifacts and the memory of George Washington. Now, from 1802 to 1818, he oversaw the construction of a Greek temple modeled along the banks of the Potomac River. Everybody know what that place is? What place is that?
Custis Mansion, and they're on that hill.
Yeah, it's called Arlington House, but originally he named it Mount Washington in honor of George Washington.
Right.
He changed it later after his ancestral home, Arlington, which is on the eastern shore of Virginia, stuck out in the middle of the bay, and there's nothing left there today except ruins of the original house. So we've got Arlington House. In 1804, he marries the wealthy, attractive, and devout and intelligent Mary Lee Fitzhugh. Another smart girl he marries who has money. These guys are marrying girls with money. They're not dumb. So, they're not dumb. So Lee's mother-in-law goes by the nickname of Molly. Well, they would have 5 children. Only one survived. The to-be Mrs. Robert E. Lee. She was spoiled, but she was intelligent, she was well-read, she was well-educated, she was headstrong, practical, and above all, very persuasive. When their young daughter, the to-be Mrs. Robert E. Lee, Mary Ann Randolph Custis, said that she wanted to marry Robert E. Lee, they were like, no, we don't think so. They said, you know, you may recall that his father, the last time he got married, their family had him sign a prenuptial agreement. So, see, Lee Marvin wasn't the first guy that had to do that back in the 80s. So Light Horse Harry Lee had to sign a prenuptial, but she convinced him. He doesn't have any money. He's a young lieutenant in the United States Army. He's got his name. But they were definitely in love, and she persuaded him, and they won her over. And Lee would get a good father-in-law, and he would get a mother, because she would take the place of his mother, and they were very, very, very close. It was quite interesting. Here's how it's described. Thus, at Arlington House on a rainy Thursday evening, June 30th, 1831, Miss Custis became Mrs. Robert E. Lee, a union that would last nearly 4 decades. As a wedding gift, Lee's father-in-law gave him 2 pistols that Lafayette had given George Washington. Initially, his wife traveled with him to his transfers post. She was at Fortress Monroe when their first child was born, but she didn't like being on the road, and she went back to Arlington to live there. Now, some people over the years wonder how devoted and dedicated Lee was to his wife. Every morning when he was home on leave, he would put a rose by her plate at breakfast. Every morning. You remember that. You guys who went cool points remember that. But he did that every morning when he was home on leave. Now, for those of you all that study the horrors of the campaign of Petersburg, Petersburg was terrible. That 8.5 to 9 month siege was terrible. Lee has health problems, we know, at that time. He's got a lot on his plate, doesn't he? But you know what? Robert E. Lee, during the entire time he was married for 39 years, never forgot their wedding anniversary. Ever. Now, how bad is it Petersburg? Petersburg is bad, but listen to this. Here's a letter that he wrote to his wife on their anniversary when he's at Petersburg. Do you recall what a happy day 33 years ago this was? How many hopes and pleasures it gave birth to? God has been very merciful and kind to us, and how thankless and sinful I have been. I pray that He may continue His mercies and blessings to us, and give us a little peace and rest together in this world, and finally gather us and all He has given us around His throne in the world to come. Now, Lee was a devoted husband, and as his wife's frail body began to falter from crippling arthritis and childbearing, who is she marrying? His mother. She's having the same health problems. She goes from a cane, a walker, to a wheelchair. Robert E. Lee's wife. And this is in her 50s, 40s and 50s. So it was pretty rough. They would be together more their last final 5 years at Washington College than ever. Now, you won't find this unless you peruse Federal Army reports, and they don't tell you about it in the history books. Robert E. Lee's wife did not want to leave Arlington House when the war starts. Now, she has 3 plantations. White House, Roman Coke, and Arlington House. The other ones are down east on the Pamunkey River. Okay? She leaves Arlington House. He finally beseeches her to leave Arlington House. She goes to White House. He finally convinces her, you've got to come to Richmond. You've got to leave. McClellan's army is coming up the peninsula. You've got to get out of there. So she finally leaves. Well, you won't find this, as I made mention. It took a lot of digging, but it's true. It's interesting. While she was fleeing White House, federal cavalry overtook her carriage and captured her in Hanover County, Virginia. They escorted her back to McClellan's headquarters. You know what they did to her? McClellan personally apologized for any inconvenience, signed a pass for her, and gave her an escort back to the lines so she could go to Richmond. Gee, war's changed, hasn't it? That'd probably be all over CNN, and we'd lock her up somewhere. But look at that. How gentlemanly was that? So Mrs. Lee was captured and released and allowed to go join her husband in Richmond. Now, let's talk about Robert E. Lee, the caring and loving father. They would have 7 children. And I said earlier, you made note, usually about 9 months after Lee came home on leave, there'd be a baby would show up. Well, there's no cable. I mean, you know, what do you do? So they had 7 children. And Lee has been, this is what his children called him. They called him Papa. They called him Father or Sir. He did not name any of his children after his father. He admired his father, but he didn't name any of the children after his father. That was interesting. He didn't believe in corporal punishment. He believed in strong moral leadership. I'm sure you all have heard the story about the snow and the footprints in the snow, where Lee's walking in the snow and he talked to a young fellow and he says, you know what, see the young man, your child is following you in the snow. He's walking in your footsteps doing the same thing you do. So we all have to remember that. I was at my goddaughter's in Mosby's Confederacy a few weeks ago, and I was out on the veranda doing one of my terrible habits that's still legal, smoking a cigar. And a little 10-year-old boy came out there and he had a stick and he had a little bit of smoke on the end of it. He was emulating me. He was smoking a cigar. So the children do mirror. We all did that. We all do it, and Lee led by a strong moral example, and that's how he did it. Now, briefly with his children, George Washington Custis Lee, they all had nicknames. I bet some of y'all got nicknames here. Now, the oldest son, born at Fortress Monroe, his nickname was Boo. But if you really knew him, they called him Bunny. Nickname was Bunny. Now, he lived to be 81 years old, never got married. But he did something at West Point his father didn't do. Does anybody know what Boo did at West Point? He graduated number 1. Wow. Number 1. Can you imagine what it would be like going through West Point and your father had been there and all that? Can you imagine that?
No demerits, Steve.
Yeah, no demerits for him either. He was methodical and serious. He got the blue dog a lot, like Churchill called it. He would get depressed a lot. He had a 7-year career in the U.S. Army. He was one of the best engineers in the U.S. Army. He resigned his commission. He was personally selected by President Davis to be on his staff and served the entire time. Towards the end of the war, he goes into the field and he is captured, but he's exchanged. After the war, he's appointed a professor at VMI, and when his father died, he took over the presidency of Washington University. Now, there was some talk earlier, and a little inside bar track, if you get to Lee's attorney, Lewis Smith's attorney's records. What happens to Arlington House when the Lees leave? Does anybody know? What happened to the Lee Custis Mansion? What happened to Arlington House?
Started burying the...
Started burying people. There's one thing, okay? Do you know?
Cemetery.
Turning into a cemetery. Arlington National Cemetery, okay? Does anybody know why?
They wanted to embarrass the families.
Oh, you know, we went by the law.
Oh.
What they would do is, if you own property, you had to pay your property tax in person.
Oh, they could.
Robert E. Lee had his attorney in Alexandria, Mr. Smith, try to pay the taxes, and they wouldn't do it. So they foreclosed on it for non-payment of taxes. Now, it gets really, really personal. Montgomery Meigs is the Quartermaster General of the United States Army. Montgomery Meigs and Robert E. Lee had been like brothers. And when Lee resigned his commission to go south, Meigs considered him a traitor. And when Meigs' son gets killed, that even makes it worse. He gets killed in Shenandoah. So that makes it even worse. So they're literally in Washington City, they're running out of graveyards. There's not enough graveyards. So they've got this 1,100 acres, and they're going to do quite well there. And the first grave was not in the Rose Garden. That happened later. They buried them down by the wall. So that's how Arlington Cemetery came to be. Well, you know what Boo did after the war? Excuse me, Bunny? It was interesting. Robert E. Lee's wife never got over losing her home. She would sue the government, and they would never win. Well, Boo was successful. In 1883, the Supreme Court ruled that the United States government illegally seized that property and awarded it back to the Lee family. However, kind of hard to live there now, right? So what they did was they gave them the fair market price, which was $150,000 at the time. So they really did win in the long run. So Boo was a pretty talented fellow. Ends up being the president, of Washington Lee. Now, William Henry Fitzhugh Lee, Rooney, he lived to be 54, tall, dark-headed, massive build, good-looking. He was interesting. When he was 7 years old, you know what he did back there? Hey, you back there at the wall. When he was 7 years old, he was playing with a hatchet. You know what he did? He chopped his fingers off. Chopped 2 of his fingers off in the barn. Had a little hatchet. I guess he wasn't paying attention because he was plugging into something back here he's looking at, and he chopped 2 of his fingers off. Well, one of the servants went and got him, and they sewed him back on, but he could never use them again. So Rooney's an interesting fellow. He's not very good with money, but when he goes to school, he does quite well. He gets married. He has a short enlistment in the Army. He did quite well. He ended up doing quite well in the Confederate Army until he was captured. He was captured and at Brandy Station. He was wounded. Took him to Hanover County. He was captured and put him in prison in Fort Lafayette, New York, which is right in New York City. There's a sad bar to that. His wife, Charlotte, is sick at the time, and she and one of the Lee girls come to Warrenton, North Carolina. Warren County, Jones Springs, it's a spa. And Charlotte was sick, and Rooney wanted to go see her, and they wouldn't let him. Actually, his brother said, I'll go and serve in his stead. You can keep me prisoner, but they wouldn't allow that to happen. And Charlotte would later die. After the war, Rooney goes and farms at White House, and he was elected to the Congress, and he died at the age of 54. Now, if you read one book about Robert E. Lee, write this down. One of the best books you can get is written by Robert E. Lee, Jr. Anybody heard of Robert E. Lee, Jr.? Jr. They called him Rob. Energetic, lived to be 71. Went to private schools. He was going to the University of Virginia when the war started. His mother didn't want him to go off to the war, but he finally did. And in 62, you know what he did? He joined as a private. He didn't want any of that fancy stuff. He was a private. He was with the Rockbridge Artillery. He served at Antietam, Sharpsburg, and Fredericksburg. At one time at Fredericksburg, his father rode up on him and didn't recognize him because of all the soot, gunpowder, and dust. Didn't even recognize his own son. And they had an exchange of pleasantries, and they went on about doing their business. He thought a great deal of his son, but his son didn't take advantage of it. He worked his way up. He got promoted to captain and did quite well. When President Davis is fleeing south in Greensboro, that's how far Rob goes with him. And then Rob says, I'm going back, and he got his parole. But Rob goes all the way to Greensboro with the president at that time. He goes back. It's kind of funny, after the war, he goes back and lives at Roman Coke Farm, and his father came to see him one time, and Rob was a bachelor at the time, and he was hoping he'd get married, so they went out for a buggy ride, and he wrote to Mrs. Lee, says, Rob doesn't have a cup of sauce or a plate that matches in his house, and he drives his carriage much too fast. Kind of like cars today. So see, it's relative. It's relative to the times. He would get married. Unfortunately, Lee would not meet the wife because Lee would be dead, Robert E. Lee would be dead. And he lives to be 71, and his descendants are still alive today. Mary Custis Lee, they called her daughter. She was the eldest, lived to be 83. Straight posture, horsewoman, intelligent, outspoken, well-read, well-traveled, heavily courted. Guess who one of her boyfriend was? A young cadet by the name of James Ewell Brown Stewart. That would have been interesting, wouldn't it? Jeb Stewart. But it didn't work out. Lee was very possessive of his daughters, but this girl got more autonomy for some reason. After her death, she inherited quite a bit of money, and she traveled throughout the world. And I guess you'd say she was kind of like a self-promoter. She traveled all over the world, and she would send cables ahead, telegrams ahead, saying that Robert E. Lee's daughter was coming. And she was greeted by the crown heads of Europe, and she was put up in the nicest palaces and hotels. And the only reason she came back to the States was the Great War was beginning in 1914, and she came back. But she lived to be 83 years old, and she never married, as any of them did. Now, Annie Carter Lee, Annie. The second daughter was very dear to Mr. and Mrs. Lee. She was the only casualty that the family had during the War of Secession. Annie would die. Remember, Annie goes to Jones Spring in Warren County to help her sister-in-law. She contracts typhus and she dies there, and she's buried there. She's the only Lee child who doesn't have her picture taken. She's born with a wine-stained birthmark on her face. And you listen to this young lady, never do what Robert E. Lee's daughter did. She was running with scissors, and she fell and almost put her eye out. And it cut her face up terribly. Well, you're a wise young lady. You're a wise young lady, because she almost lost her eye, but she never wanted her to have her picture taken, and they didn't make her have her picture taken. But unfortunately, she passed away at 23 years of age. Later, in 1994, her remains were brought to Washington Lee University. We've got Eleanor Agnes Lee Wiggs. She lived to be 32. They said she was the loveliest of the daughters. She had a lot of suitors and courters. One fellow she dated was Colonel Orton Williams, Confederate colonel. And the Lees had a problem with Mr. Williams. He liked hard spirits. Now, Robert E. Lee would take an occasional glass of wine. But Robert E. Lee believed that if you couldn't control your desire for liquor, you couldn't control yourself, how could you be in control of other people? And they weren't real thrilled about her dating him. And they broke up, and then he takes an assignment, and he's captured behind lines in Tennessee in a federal uniform and is hung as a spy. And her friends say that she never recovered from that. She always stayed at home. She died of TB at the age of 32. And again, never got married. Mildred Child Lee, precious life. Her and her father were very close. They exchanged letters like all the Lee girls. She was well read, and she was attentive to her father. He was quite possessive. She was an amazing young lady. She wrote a small book called Recollections, where she reflected upon her father's final illness and death. And they asked her why she never got married. And this is what she said: "To me, he seems a hero, and all other men small in comparison." So it's quite interesting. Now, we know Robert E. Lee at the Academy is great in engineering. He's number one in engineering school. But Lee was smart about his education. They didn't have much money, so he got a free education at West Point. But Lee was a hands-on guy. Now, the marble man you see and the image you've had, Robert E. Lee, if you go back and read the accounts, could tell manly jokes. Everybody understand what that means? He could tell dirty jokes. He didn't motivate those guys walking around like this all the time, "I'm the marble man." Robert E. Lee could relate to the common soldier. When Robert E. Lee was an engineer, it was not uncommon to see Lee at a site up to his waist in river water doing designs and doing his job. In St. Louis today, you can still go there. There are plaques there today. When he was an engineer, the Mississippi River was silting up the port. He redirected the Mississippi River in St. Louis so it could stay a viable port that it is still today. He was a good draftsman. He was a good designer. The length and breadth from Texas all up and down the East Coast, he built fortifications, Fort Pulaski. He improved fortifications at Fort Hamilton. He was the top engineer for fortifications in the United States Army. It was unbelievable. And he traveled countless thousands of miles. Now, when his father-in-law dies, remember George Washington Parke Custis, he wasn't a very good farm manager. He didn't do very good with his money. He dies in 1857. Lee got a 2-year leave of absence from the Army. They let him leave the Army for 2 years to be the executor of his father's estate. Now we've got 3 plantations: Arlington House, Roman Coke, and White House Plantation. So all those are losing money. Arlington House is, quote, in deplorable condition. When her father dies, Robert E. Lee's father-in-law dies, he hadn't done well. Her inheritance was a $10,000 debt. Now, at that time, $17 to one of our dollars today.
Wow.
So she was $170,000 in debt. That's how much the dollar's gone down since 1860s. So 17 to 1. Lee comes back. He'd always had an eye, said, maybe one day I wouldn't mind being a farmer. So, when I get out of the Army. So he comes back, he turns it around. They put in good crops. They get rid of livestock that's not producing. They put a mill to work. He stays there for 2 years. And when he leaves, and the farm comes back, Arlington Plantation comes back, $40,000 in the black. So they got out of $10,000 in the debt, multiply that by 17, then they go to $40,000 in the black. So that's pretty good. That's really, really good. Really quite unusual. Now, here's another thing that Francis Smith, his attorney. Now, we know about the Emancipation Proclamation when President Lincoln signs that in November. And we know that the Emancipation Proclamation only addresses indentured servants, slaves, and servants, bonded slaves in these states that are in rebellion, right? We all know about that. They don't free the slaves and the indentured servants. We don't have the 13th Amendment passed until after the war. So he's not freeing the slaves in the northern states, only in the states that are in rebellion. Well, here's an interesting sidebar. In his father-in-law's will that leaves the executor, Francis Smith is the attorney. 5 years after his father-in-law dies in 1857, he said, you free all the slaves at Arlington House. So through his attorney, Lee's in Richmond in 1862. And through his attorney, he signs the papers, and they free all the slaves before the Emancipation Proclamation at Arlington. So they were ahead of the curve. Also, after the war, Lee gets involved a little bit, trying to bring the railroad to Southwest Virginia, which is successful. Now, we know, as an educator, Lee's early education, coupled with a stellar performance at West Point, did not escape the attention of his superiors. Totally out of the blue, he did not request assignment to the military academy at West Point. Major Lee is given the command and is the superintendent of West Point. Didn't want it, didn't like it, was unhappy, tried to get things done, tried to be an innovator, tried to make things work, ran into too much red tape. Imagine that. And the old salts wouldn't change. But there are a couple things that he did change, along with influencing countless dozens of men that would serve as Union officers and Confederate officers when the War of Secession starts. Anybody ever seen the tall gray hats the cadets still wear on the plane at West Point, the Shako hat? Robert E. Lee designed that hat. They still wear that hat today. And something's interesting. You know, everybody gets all upset because you have to speak Spanish and you shouldn't have to do bilingual stuff and all this and that and everything. When Lee and Thomas Jackson are serving in Mexico, guess what? They both learned Spanish phrases. Hello? They're ahead of the curve. When Lee goes back to West Point, they have to start taking Spanish lessons. He had been out west. The Spanish population outnumbered the Anglo population. So he knew that, so he was ahead of the curve. He was glad to get out of there. When that assignment ended, he went back to Texas as a light colonel, so he was glad. So we skip on with the wars in and out. 10 years later, in 1865, Virginia had witnessed 70% of the engagements of the war. The land, the people, the homes, the town, the social structures were devastated. Could you imagine waking up tomorrow and your money's worthless? Think about it. Think about it. Your credit card don't work because it's on the Bank of Richmond. You might squirrel away some gold, that'd be good. But your greenbacks and all your money and your stocks and bonds, hey, go ahead and throw it in the parking lot. They ain't worth anything. That's sad. And that's what they had to put back together. Lee was a rational man, and he knew that he had to rebuild his home state, and education was imperative. So they removed themselves from the limelight. He and Mrs. Lee left Richmond, and they went to Cumberland County, Virginia, stayed at an old farmhouse. The daughters hated it. They said the biggest activity he had there was the acorns falling on the roof. Lee liked it because he would take Traveler and they'd go right up to Bremo Falls and look at the James River. He really liked it. And Mrs. Lee, it was okay, but there wasn't anything to do and they hated it. Well, the fledgling college in Lexington, Washington College, had 40 students. And they were trying to revitalize the school. That originally was a school started at Liberty Hall by George Washington, had given money a long, long time ago. And so they said, we'd like for you to be on the staff there. He tells them, I cannot teach. My health will not allow me to be a teacher, but I'll be the administrator. So the family's elated. They moved to Lexington. Everyone's happy there. They have classic studies of Greek and Latin. He ushered in such courses as engineering, modern farming techniques, commerce, law, astronomy, which Lee was very good at, modern languages, and journalism. Lee was not a big fan of newspapers until after the war, but they have one of the best journalism schools probably in the United States at Washington University. So it was quite interesting. He held those students, they didn't care if you were rich, didn't care if you were poor. You were all held to the same honor code. There was young guy who would partake and get into fights because he was rich, he thought he could get away with it. You didn't want to get called to the president's office. He was gone. Didn't care who didn't care who it was. You were gone. There was one story. He said, "My only objective is to endeavor to make them see true interest, to teach them to labor diligently for their improvement, and prepare them for the great work of life." The honor code. There was one really good case that was written by Mr. Graham, who was a student there, and nobody wanted to get called to the president's office. Well, Mr. Graham and his roommates, they lived 4 to a room, got called from their dorm to the president's office, to Lee's office. And what had happened was, there had been an explosion. And they want to know what was going on. So Mr. Graham tells them what happened. They had gone out and they'd bought a bunch of firewood. You just didn't go over and turn the switch on and the fans came on. You know, you had to have firewood and fireplaces and stoves. So they noticed that their stack of firewood kept getting gone. Like, where's our wood? So these guys are young, smart guys. They took a little drill and they drilled a hole in some of the wood and poured some gunpowder in it. And then they put the plug back in the hole. Well, that explosion, the reason they got called to the president's office was one of the professors' stove blew up. So he had been borrowing their wood. So they're in there, and Mr. Graham, let's see exactly, I believe they brought before the president, and here's what the exchange between Lee and Mr. Graham. General Lee: "Well, Mr. Graham, your plan to find out who was taking your wood was a good one, but the powder charge is a little too heavy. Next time, use less powder." So it was a good plan. The matter was concluded. At the time of his death in 1870, Washington College was well on its way to becoming a premier institution that it is today, and it was dutifully renamed Washington Lee University. Now, we're getting towards the back turn here. I want to tell you about the man based on the records and based on descriptions of the people that were there. He was described at the height 70 to 72 inches. That's from West Point. His hair was dark, broad shoulder, muscular build, small feet, wore a size 4.5 boot. 4.5, I know. The rigors of outdoor life kept him fit. As a father, he encouraged his children to undertake physical activities such as skating, no computers, getting out, walking, running, swimming, sledding. Lee liked to ride. It was invigorating. He enjoyed that. The first picture painted of Robert E. Lee was a portrait painted in 1838. I did not bring it because he's in uniform. He's a young lieutenant. He is a stud muffin. He's a good-looking guy. He's a sharp-looking young man. Okay, this photo is in the 1850s. This is close to what Lee looks like when the War of Secession starts. This is what he close to looks like. Now, medical evidence now indicates that possibly beginning in his late 40s and early 50s, Lee is starting to have circulation problems along with slight pain and numbness in his left arm. So he's having circulation problems and heart problems. We know that. Salt and pepper hair. When Lee leaves the Army at 54, he's 54 years of age when he leaves the United States Army after 36 years of service to go with his native state. Salt and pepper hair, mustache. For a man of his age, during those times, and having experienced the rigors of outdoor military life, he was still a formidable figure. Now, the gray-bearded man, known by so many people, suddenly and surprisingly appears. The Robert E. Lee that you all know, here's how it happened. In the winter of 1861-62, he was on President Davis's staff. He was his military advisor. They sent him to Western Virginia. Remember, West Virginia doesn't become a state until 1863, so that belongs to Virginia. There are 2 generals there that are military appointees, Wise and Loring. They can't agree that it gets dark at night. So the president sends Lee there to mediate these 2 generals. It is nasty, it is rainy, it is sleety, it is snowy. There ain't no paved roads. Lee's luggage got lost, and they lost his shaving kit. His toiletry kit and his shaving kit was in his luggage. That's when the gray-bearded Robert E. Lee that you know starts to grow his beard by accident. But it is stylish, and he keeps it. When he returns home in a couple of months to Richmond, his wife and daughters are aghast as to how much he had aged. his beard and his hair had turned almost gray to white. But that's how Robert E. Lee, so it's only the last 8 years of Lee's life that he wears a beard. Otherwise, this is pretty much what Robert E. Lee looks like. Now, I made mention earlier that he didn't wear that dress uniform and his dress hat that is depicted in the films. This is a first-hand description. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremantle was a British observer. Fremantle did okay for himself. Being a field marshal in the Victorian Army, did quite well. He was an observer. Here's what he writes in 1863. This is during the advancement into Pennsylvania. Quote, about Lee. He is 56 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, a thorough soldier in appearance, and his manners are most courteous and full of dignity. He has none of the vices such as smoking, drinking, chewing, or swearing. He generally wears a well-worn long gray jacket, a high black felt hat, and blue trousers tucked into his Wellington boots. I never saw him carry arms, and the only mark of military rank are 3 stars on his collar. He himself is very neat in dress and person, and in the most arduous marches, he always looks smart and clean. So that's what Robert E. Lee looks like on the job, not the dress uniform. So he was doing it. Now let's talk about some of his likes and dislikes. The girls are like this. Robert E. Lee's got sons and daughters, and Lee enjoyed the company of young children and bright young ladies. Robert E. Lee liked having his feet and hands tickled. And when he took his children in at night, he would tell them, no tickling, no story. So he wouldn't tell them a bedtime story until they tickled him. He preferred to retire not later than 10 p.m. He rose early. He planned his day. He liked dogs, cats, and horses. Anybody know what Lee's favorite beverage was? Don't go there, Keith, you know. His favorite beverage, we know he doesn't drink much, buttermilk. Buttermilk. That'll come to play later, but that's his favorite beverage of all the things in the world. He enjoyed riding. He didn't like cruelty to animals. There are several instances where he stopped people from beating horses. In the Pennsylvania campaign, he comes up on a captain who's whipping a horse. Lee, quote, don't whip him, Captain, don't whip him. I've got just such another foolish horse myself, and whipping does no good. So he was kind to children, he was kind to animals, all the right ingredients. He liked going to health spas. He went there with his wife. Actually, if you go to the Greenbrier Springs, you can stay in the Baltimore cottage that they stayed in if you can afford it. I cannot. He disliked the use of tobacco in any form. He warned his sons. He didn't like politicians. He didn't like newspapers until later. He didn't partake in spirits, as I made mention. And he didn't think if you control drinking, you shouldn't be in charge of others. He did not like having his picture taken. His wife had to convince him to have his picture taken. The last picture he had taken was in 1869 to help raise money for the college and for a strapped friend, General Samuel Cooper, who had been his senior in the Confederate Army, that most people don't know anything about. He hated anybody being late. If you were supposed to be somewhere, he would start the meeting if you weren't there, and if you were supposed to go somewhere else and you weren't there, he'd leave, including his family. He liked you to be on time, so that was interesting. Pets and horses, the entire Lee household. The girls like cats, the guys like dogs. There's one dog that Lee had a favorite, though, when he was stationed in Baltimore, and I have to render this to you to show you again how human he was. He rescued a black and tan terrier. He named it Speck. And Speck would follow him to his office every day. And this is what Lee writes to his wife when she's back at Arlington. I am very solitary, and my only company is my dog and cats. But Speck has become so jealous now that he will hardly let me look at the cats. He seems afraid that I'm going off from him and never lets me stir without him. He lies down in the office from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. without moving and turns himself by the fire as the side from it becomes cold. I catch him sometimes sitting up looking at me so intently that I am for a moment startled. He went to church one day, and he didn't want Speck to follow him, so he locked him in the house, and Speck went up to the second-story window, jumped off onto the porch, and followed him to church and was waiting for him when he came out. Unfortunately, Speck just disappeared one day, and they said Lee was quite distraught. They never found Speck, never knew what happened. I guess the strangest pet that he owned was during the War of Secession. I'm sure some of you heard about Nellie the chicken. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, when Lee was camped near Hamilton's Crossroads on the southern end of the line, a chicken came in and ran under his cot. Now, Lee's no dummy. Fresh eggs, that'll work. Nellie rode on the headquarters wagon. the entire time they went into the Pennsylvania campaign, and Nellie stays with the headquarters wagon as Lee's pet until 1864 when they're encamped at Orange Courthouse in Culpeper County. It's quoted by one of the servants that the chicken disappeared upon the arrival of and dinner for a Confederate congressman. I guess Nellie ended up in the pot. Okay, now, real quickly, somebody in here, you all got your favorite car, you got your favorite truck. But if it's the 19th century, you don't have a car or a truck, do you? So what do you got? Horses. Right, that's your main way to get around. That is your car, that is your vehicle, that is your truck. Lee liked horses. And it suggested that perhaps his father helped him learn how to ride, but he was only 4 when he left, so they kind of doubt that. But we know he gets really, really good horsemanship in Kinloch and Fauquier at Mr. Turner's plantation. Now, the first horse he rides, Fancy Traveler. Now, we've got Grace Darling. This is the horse, this is your Toyota horse. Grace Darling. Captain Robert E. Lee purchased Grace Darling, a brown mare in Texas during the Mexican War. The horse was wounded 7 times and never went down. He brought her back to Virginia, where she was seized by federal troops from Rooney's farm at White House in 1862. Robb located the horse and recovered it in 1866. And Grace lived to be 33 years old. Now that's one of those 200,000-mile Toyotas, isn't it? Little is known of horses by the name of Richmond, Brown Roan, and Ajax. Now, Lucy Long, you may have read when you read the Gettysburg campaign, was a sorrel given to General Lee by the one-time cadet James Ewell Brown Stewart in 1862, and he rode that horse in relief of Traveler. Stewart had kind of, peed in his porridge and upset the general, so he gave him a horse, Lucy Long, and he kept that horse the entire time for the war. Now, we all know about Traveler. Here's how Lee and Traveler become meshed together. The first encounter was when he was on that unpleasant duty in West Virginia, 1861-62. The horse's name was Greenbrier. It was owned by a South Carolina officer. It was an iron gray, black-mared, and black-tailed creature. Originally had been called Jeff Davis. So this horse has got an identity crisis. Greenbrier Jeff Davis. 16 hands high, born in 1857 in Blue Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. Later, when Lee was attached to inspection duties along the North Carolina, South Carolina coast and the Georgia coast, he met the officer again and he sold the horse to him for $200. It is not clear if the mount was named for his boyhood favorite or that they would travel many miles together. You get 2 versions. They're going to travel many miles together, or Fancy Traveler is his first horse that he's riding. So that's interesting. Lee did not feel a day was complete without a ride on Traveler. They were recognized by one and all throughout Virginia. When Lee gets appointed to the presidency at Washington College, the first house isn't done. And the president's house isn't finished. They live somewhere else. We'll talk about that briefly in a minute. But when they build the house, there's a stable right next to the president's house. You can go there today. It's the house that Lee died in, and the president of the university still lives there. And now the stable is a garage. And when last there was a nice BMW parked inside. But if you notice, there's the door, and it's bolted. You can't open it any further. You can't close it. And they said that when Traveler was in there, Traveler didn't like the door closed. So they kept the door open all the time so Traveler could wander in and out. And Traveler would be seen on the campus, grazing on the campus, because if you are aware, Washington University is here, and then right across the lawn is Virginia Military Institute. So the horse would just roam around. Unfortunately, Traveler would step on a nail and die, and Traveler would be buried there right outside. So that was quite unfortunate. Now, we know that Lee is touted the Christian warrior like Thomas Jackson. However, if you go back and you look at the records, Lee attended church on a regular basis. There's no doubt about that. His mother was an Anglican, which of course after we become the United States, there's not many Anglicans left, they're Episcopalians. He did go to church. Lee did not get baptized in the Episcopalian Anglican Church. He went regularly to services. It wasn't until after the death of his mother-in-law, Molly Custis, herself a devout Christian, that he was confirmed in the Episcopal Church at the age of 46. That's 1853. So basically he gets baptized at that age. In 19th century America, religion was more part of the moral fiber of the nation than it is today, perhaps. Whenever he could, Lee went to churches, some of the ones he went to. Christ Church in Alexandria, the same church George Washington went to. The Cadet Chapel at West Point. St. John's Episcopal Church at Fort Hamilton, New York. He was a vestryman there. That was interesting, too, because there was a young lieutenant there by the name of Thomas Jackson who was baptized there in 1849 when he was in the U.S. Army. He also attended church, St. San Antonio Episcopal Church in San Antonio, where he helped start the church there when he was in Texas. St. Paul's in Richmond, St. Thomas in Orange Courthouse, St. Paul's in Petersburg, Grace Episcopal, and the Washington College Chapel. Now, the house that he never owned, Lee did not own a house. They finally admit to that. His father didn't own a house. He lived with relatives. After he gets appointed to West Point, he's living in barracks. He's living in tents. He's living in hotels. It's his wife's house. It's very specific. Arlington House belongs to his wife. So she owns the house. So he always went back there. He called it home. It was interesting. Lee did rent a house in Richmond called The Mess. It's 707 East Franklin. It's still there. It's surrounded by high rises and a parking deck. It's the headquarters for the American Home Builders Association today. And so they did rent that house, but Lee never owned a home, unfortunately. When they left, as I made mention earlier, they went to Cumberland County and stayed there for a while. Then they go to Lexington, and he takes over the presidency of the college, and they live there. And they're there together until he passes away. Now, real quickly with Robert E. Lee's health. Every one of us in here has health concerns with Lee. We know in 1847 he received a gunshot wound in the Mexican War. We actually also know that after 36 straight hours in the saddle, he fell off of the horse Grace. He'd been on recon and scouting positions and fell from exhaustion from his horse. 1862, during the War of Secession, he rode ahead of his staff en route to 2nd Manassas. His left cheek is grazed near Thoroughfare Gap by a Federal sharpshooter. He goes back and he tells his staff he didn't want to alarm Mrs. Lee and never mention it. And they don't until they put it in their books, Marshall and Taylor. But Lee gets shot and grazed right here in 62. 62, you won't read this. You've got to go through the family records. After the successful campaign, the Battle of 2nd Manassas, Lee's having a staff meeting at a creek. It had been raining. He had a slicker on. Something startled Traveler. Lee lunged to get Traveler. What's the first thing you do when you start to fall?
Throw your hands up.
He fractured and broke his right wrist and his left wrist. On the advancement into Sharpsburg, across the Potomac, Robert E. Lee is in an ambulance. He's in a carriage, or he has to be led. Confirmation about this, he writes his son Rob, after 6 weeks, I can finally dress myself. So during that invasion, during that advancement into Maryland, he's in splints. You don't read that, you have to dig for that one. In 62, while at Sharpsburg, sitting on Traveler, a cannon blast came dangerously close between Lee and Longstreet. In 62, standing with members of his command atop Telegraph Hill, now Lee Hill, I call it by the original name, in Fredericksburg, a bursting cannon sent Lee and Longstreet and their staff to the ground but didn't kill them. In 63, in the time frame of Brandy Station, the largest cavalry engagement where his son was captured, between that and Gettysburg, we know now that Lee has a minor heart attack. In 63, during the final assault on the Federal line at Gettysburg, Lee withdrew to his tent as a result of a serious case of bleeding piles. Everybody know what piles is? Hemorrhoids. Same thing Napoleon did. His staff reports that it bled through his uniform pants. He had to go back to his tent. He couldn't sit in the saddle anymore. 1864, remember his favorite beverage, buttermilk? 1864, during the Wilderness Campaign, while standing on the porch of the Ellington farm, a cannonball comes and lodges right above him. The next day, he's secluded to his tent between 2 to 5 days for food poisoning from buttermilk. You know what happens when you get food poisoning? You can't stay out of the bathroom? Both ways. Lee knew his health was deteriorating. I don't know if he really realized it or not, but you can find it in the archives. After the Gettysburg campaign, he submitted his resignation in writing to the president to resign and turn over the command of the Army of Northern Virginia to a more suitable, healthy candidate. And Davis refused, would not let him resign. Who was going to choose? I don't know. So he knew his health was getting bad. He slowed down, but he still liked his daily rides. He's in his 60s now. He rarely lost his temper. It said that when it did flare up, he was either tired or ill. And there was only 2 instances, and one that I'm citing here with A.P. Hill, poor pal Hill. He was dying of a social disease anyway. And Lee tried to get Hill to be as energetic as Jackson had been, but they're different people. And they were at a staff meeting, and they were there, and Lee was getting upset with A.P. Hill, and he said, "Why can't you be like Jackson?" And they're all going like, "Oh, okay." They were like, "Oh, okay." So, okay. And he got a twitch in his neck right here, and it turned pink when he got mad. So that was interesting. That's right from the fellows that were there. His demise would be contributed to heart condition, hardening of the arteries, pneumonia, and we know at the end he had a stroke. Now, Lee knew his health was deteriorating, but he tried to make the world a better place every day. But you know something funny? Lee was frugal, never declared bankruptcy, invested wisely, saved money wisely, did well, never got in the straits like his father did. And he took care of his family. That was very, very, very interesting how he did that. So, excuse me, it was good how he had good fiscal accountability for his descendants. Well, October 1870, Lee goes to a church meeting. He leaves the university, the college. Been rainy, cold, been really, 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 really bad weather. And he gets chilled. And he comes home, and he has trouble breathing. And he's tired, and he's cold. And now we know he's probably had a stroke. He couldn't talk. He was relegated to bed. He was attended to by local doctors in the loving care of his daughters and his wife. And they thought he would recover. On Tuesday, October the 11th, 1870, he slipped into a coma. Later, with his wife by his side, she recalled he cried out, "Tell Hill he must come up." His last audible words were, "Strike the tent." Then, on Wednesday morning, October 12th, a sunny day, about 9 a.m., surrounded by his family, Robert E. Lee passed into eternity. The announcement of his death spread throughout the nation and the world, from the Queen of England to people all over the world. He was laid to rest in the new Lee family vault beneath the college chapel that his son had designed. Now, ever since the conclusion of the War of Secession, there have been calls by politicians and the federal government to have Robert E. Lee arrested and tried for treason. Twice he was summoned before judicial bodies. After the action became known to him, General of the Army Ulysses S. Grant, soon to be the 18th president, threatened to resign if Robert E. Lee was not accorded the same conditions of parole as all Southern soldiers had been afforded. With Grant's intervention, no further judicial actions were directed towards Lee, but there was one point that continued to bother him. He couldn't get over this. It was stuck in the back of his mind. He didn't want to cause any problems. He wanted to maintain harmony. He was trying to get his citizenship back. Because if you look at it from the eyes of the United States government, they had rebelled against the lawful authority. They had committed treason. Lee submitted all of his paperwork. He filled out the form. He sent it in. Now, he couldn't vote. He couldn't run for office, not that he wanted to, even though people had beseeched him to do that. He couldn't buy property. Couldn't do much of anything because he wasn't a citizen of the United States. Couldn't figure it out. Well, in 1970, a century after Robert E. Lee's passing of natural causes, the mystery was solved. His application had been properly completed and received by the United States government. It found its way to the Secretary of State's desk, William Seward. You know, the fellow that buys Alaska later? Seward has it. Seward assumed that it had been processed and gave the form bearing Lee's signature as a cherished souvenir to a friend of his. He said, "Here's Robert E. Lee's signature. You can have that as a souvenir." Well, a century after his death, the application was discovered in a bundle of papers in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Befittingly, in 1975, President Gerald Ford restored Robert E. Lee's American citizenship at a ceremony in Arlington House attended by Robert E. Lee IV and his family. Now, in closing, I would have to, and I use this from time to time when I admire people who retire from public service and stand up and do their duty, no matter how hard it is. And think about what Robert E. Lee did. He gave up everything. for what he thought he was doing was right. Everything. But Lee's life mirrored what he once wrote to his eldest son, Custis. Duty, then, is the sublimest word in our language. Do your duty in all things. You cannot do more. You should never wish to do less. Yet perhaps Winston Churchill said it best of Robert E. Lee. Quote, Lee was one of the noblest Americans who ever lived, and one of the greatest captains known to the annals of war. Thank you very much.